Let's have a conversation then and talk about our public transport system. And I keep saying our non-existent public transport system. Let's just talk about it in terms of how the public gets to transport themselves from one place to another. Now, the public transport system that we have, is it just, is it socially just, and what does that mean? We are joined by an urban planner, Constant Cap, who's been here before. He's also a member of the International Society of Urban and Regional Planners. Constant, good morning.
Good morning.
Happy Easter.
Happy Easter, everyone.
Asante sana. Thank you very much for joining us today. Kenya's biggest conversation. I like your what's it? Your top.
Oh, thanks.
UNCT.
Yeah, it's West African, you can tell.
Right.
It's not Nigerian, it's Ghanaian. So
It's Ghanaian.
yeah.
See the way she's giving you that eye.
Ghanaians have something against South Africans. I'm sorry, against Nigerians. Not South Africans. Especially on the football pitch.
All right, Constant. Into the topic. What is a socially just public transport system? What does that mean?
Socially just public transport system is in line with a just city, which is a public transport system that meets the needs of all, especially what we may call the urban invisibles. You know, urban invisibles are those people who we at times overlook or don't see or easily ignore. For example, children, elderly people, persons with disability, marginalized groups like many times women. So when it meets those needs, the environment, a system that meets those needs, and it may easily be defined along certain parameters. Okay, it is easily available. Okay, so within all neighborhoods, people are able to access that public transport system. It's easily accessible. If you're on a wheelchair, if you're a child, you can easily get onto a vehicle or whatever means you're using. Let's not assume we're only talking about vehicles. It meets the needs of human rights and dignity. Okay, and here this is very critical because we'll explain later on how some of the biggest problems in our public transport system actually rotate around this aspect of human rights and dignity, in particular with regard to the labor rights of those who work within the system. And it is also sustainable, so meeting the needs of the environment. I know now we have a lot of talk around
sustainability,
electric vehicles and such things, and being climate conscious and such. And then it's also inclusive, and everybody feels that they can safely and happily use that public transport system. So more or less along those pillars.
Sounds like some work that's been done around this.
Yes, there has been I would say some studies that have been looked into this by a multi-sectoral group known as the Socially Just Public Transport Working Group that has brought together academics, urban enthusiasts, labor union members, communication experts, etc., just to theorize around and think around what do we need to do to have a socially just public transport. In fact, the first question when we sat down over a cup of tea, we asked ourselves, what do we mean by socially just public transport system? And from doing a bit of literature review and theory, then and assessing it, we came up with these 5 pillars that I've just stated.
When one talks about the thinking around public transport, how do you explain what you've just said in a way that it then relates to, again, the subject of human rights and why it is transportation should become a human rights issue, and why it is that all this discussion about planning and forecasting and ensuring that it fits in within the ambit of human rights? How do you communicate what you've just said so that it is actually understood and one can see how it is that one more or less grows into the other and why it's relevant?
Well, you can look at it on one end from the city planning technical perspective, which is very easy for those of us who are technocrats to explain. However, on the other side, for the normal person out there on the street, okay, transport is a day-to-day, actually mobility is a day-to-day occurrence. You have to move from one place to another, be it you're going to the shops, be it you're going to school, be it you're going anywhere, wherever you're going. And you have a right to have an easy way of going, the most reliable or easy way of going to wherever you're going. And I would relate that closely to what we call the pyramid or the mobility pyramid. Okay, and the mobility pyramid first looks at the importance of walking before anything else.
First thing is walk.
Are people able? Because every journey, be it you're going to a car, to a railway station, to a bus stop, every journey includes either a walk or movement with some mobility aid. Some mobility aid, and you have the right to be safe during that walk. You have the right to feel at ease during that walk. It should not be a strenuous walk. Unfortunately, walking downtown to access bus station, for instance, you're already holding your bag. And you're already holding your bag and checking it.
Catastrophe.
And then you quickly cross the road in case someone is following you. So that aspect that you as a citizen, you have a right towards living in a dignified city.
Okay.
And transport is part of your day-to-day life.
Indeed.
And that's where I would say.
So that's where the pyramid begins.
Yeah.
Walking.
Then we can go to cycling. Okay, because walking and cycling tend to be, what we call active mobility means. Then public transport comes next. Okay, once we're able to walk or to cycle towards this good public transport, then we can now talk about having an easy way, a proper, socially just way of moving around. But we have to now look into what kind of public transport do we have.
What is public transport?
What is public transport? Public transport, that definition is actually debated upon, because some people say public transport must be provided by the public sector, but it may not necessarily be that. Okay, it is transport that is used by the public, but has to be within. In some places, like in Europe, I know they talk about it compulsory being owned by the public sector. But in some places, like in the UK, you will find it privately provided.
The hybrid.
But within a very strictly defined.
And government being a stakeholder.
Highly regulated by government.
Highly regulated by government. So it's not just you get a vehicle, put it on the road, and it moves as if it's carrying goods.
But these are planned.
Yes. And actioned. So plans are there. Action is what we don't tend to see.
I'm interested because now as you try to, as you put these together and get into that point then where you're saying you can walk or cycle then goes towards public transport, right? So to then have a system that works whereby these other things can happen, that a child who's going to school would very safely then be able to get onto a system that has either been owned or regulated by government to sit within certain lines of requirement. So there's that picture in your head, and then there's the reality. If we're looking at the Kenya example, just as an example, if you were to fit it onto that, where are the gaps? Why is it not fitting?
The pyramid tends to be inverted because we started walking, cycling, public transport. Below that, you also have shared cars, like taxis and these. You could even put borders there in a way. And then the bottom should be private cars. So the planning ordinarily should start at the top and come down. Unfortunately, and it's not only here, it's in many cities around the world, the planning has been inverted. Okay, and it's something that emerged around the 1960s, especially in North America, and it trickled down to many other parts of the world where with the advent of the private car being and the evolution of the family of the family car, transport and cities ended up being planned around
the private vehicle.
So you and sometimes you see this fascination around several highways and overhead highways,
interchanges.
Interchanges, and people talking about how this is spectacular. But now we're actually going back, and in places like Paris now they're talking about the 15-minute city, how you can easily access all your goods within a walkable, cyclable distance. So that has been it's like been an evolutionary change, and slowly we're also getting to realize that here we're still a bit excited. We want to see very big roads. We want to see expanded highways because we think it's development.
I guess it's because of how we are. Walking is almost like a given, because you'll have to walk a long distance to get that matatu. You'll have to walk a long distance to get to.
Yeah.
So it's assumed, well, because I walk anyway, so what's the prestige in walking? So you want to get into the most prestigious one, so you move into cycling. Maybe, okay, so cycling is a bit better, so like Constant Cap always constantly with his bike riding around town. This guy is, so you want to think about above that. Then you get into the matatu and the bus, and then you get into the taxi. Now, if you are the one who's actually just hailing a cab, you umepanda, wewe ndio umefika.
Yeah.
And then you get into the private vehicle, you umefika. So probably even in our thinking as Kenyans, if a governor came and campaigned on the platform of walking and cycling, we'd be looking at him and wondering,
where's the bicycle?
Because they talk about that. I mean, I remember Sonko Igade, that was among the things that Igade was talking about. We'll create these sidewalks, and people are looking at him thinking,
paths.
If you put it around my estate so I can be walking in the evening, as part of my exercise regimen, it's fine. But I need roads.
Yes and no. Yes, it's true. There is a lot of dignity prestige that comes with private vehicle ownership, and even within that private vehicle ownership, we know that there are categories. even that cycling ownership, there are categories. There's a guy who will bring you a bicycle worth $500,000, and then there's that one I bought second hand. Those are two different bicycles. That's also normal in the society. However, there's a research I did a few years ago. After the pedestrianization of Luthuli Avenue, and I did with some friends, and we questioned about quite a number, a sample of the traders along that street and the users of that street, and there was an acceptance rate of almost over 80% by the people, including people telling us stories about how they had chest congestion before and it's gone now, and such examples. Now, it's true, you cannot really campaign along the line of I will build pedestrian paths. I saw Lee Kinyanjui campaigning that, and he's not in office now. After doing a very nice job at the main street, Kenyatta Avenue,
and removing the matatus from the CBD.
Which is another story altogether. But when you provide that infrastructure, people get to appreciate it. That's the reality. When you provide good access, walking infrastructure, good access to public transport. For instance, you provide good access for people to get to Akati Road bus station or railways in a safe manner. People then appreciate it.
So when people experience it, and so that's what you're saying. So if people have the opportunity to experience it, even if before that it's something foreign to them, they have the opportunity to experience it, the likelihood of them appreciating and then maybe even demanding for it permanently then increases.
Which is what happened in Mombasa with their red carpet program. The previous CEC, Taufik Balala, who came up with, said that we're going to make all our pedestrian paths red carpet, red, to give dignity to the pedestrian. And they even banned this thing of people putting small billboards along pedestrian paths and such. And once it came through, that's when people got to appreciate that, actually, we didn't have this and now we have it. But the same goes now with the public transport. Now story is even much bigger, because there now you're talking about investors, you're talking about workers, you're talking about users, you're talking about public transport infrastructure. So it's a whole realm of people who have to be put in the picture. And many times we see the investors talking the most. We don't hear the workers talking. Many of these investors talk about how they have loans, they have this and they have that. I've never heard of one of them saying, I have to pay insurance for my staff. I have to pay NHIF for my staff. Many of these staff are on a target system, which is one of the biggest problems. That's why I was talking about this human rights aspect. One of the biggest problems in our public transport system is constant buys a vehicle, pimps it up nicely, puts on the road, tells the staff, I want 10K
at the end of every day.
With a full tank. How this guy gets that 10K, you don't care. Whether he fills it with potatoes and ferries them to Marikiti, or takes students, or drives on the wrong side of the road, you don't care. What he does after that, you don't care about him. So
what he earns, it's not your problem.
It's not your problem. So already this guy who's working on that system is working under a lot of pressure because he has to hit that target, and then he has a family at home.
18,000 bob target, actually.
Yeah, he has a family at home he has to take care of. He has other people along the system we all know who expect to be taken care of if the vehicle is locked in, and
other people to be taken care of.
and when you look at this pyramid of that I explained, even our authorities tend to give more dignity to those who are supposed to be at the bottom of that pyramid. So you find some roads public transport is not allowed to use.
So for private.
Here only, a good example is here Douglas Wakihuri Road, which used to be called Aerodome Road. Public transport cannot use that road. Yet a public transport vehicle is carrying 20, 30 people, but as private vehicles are carrying individuals. Okay, where is the social justice there? Okay, so that going back, that aspect of labor rights and human rights is critical, and it's rarely talked about. We never ask ourselves, how do these people get leave? We have many ladies now working in the public transport system. Do they have access to maternity leave? Are they paid in that case, or do they just go off the hook?
I'm thinking, there are parts, let's talk of Nairobi, where you never see a bus. The bus leaves you really far off.
Yeah.
And whatever you need to do, you need to walk to wherever you're going.
This is your living experience, city.
Yes, you've seen it. Yes. And I'm thinking, actually, let me explain to you where my mind.
You're really paid.
What happens?
Yes, because
what happens?
I South Africa, the Cape Province. There's a part of the Cape Province that if someone dropped into you and asked you where you'd think you're somewhere in Europe. You'd think you're on the principalities. But there is a train track whose sole function is to bring workers into that place and out of. And these workers are predominantly black. Okay? Now, driving through that place, that's where you have some of these huge vineyards and what have you. That region and slightly beyond it. There's a point I'm getting to here. We have similarities here. Like where I live, you do not see matatus on certain roads. Matatus end on Agweng's Kodhek Road. That's where they end. So if you're going to come inside, you're going to figure out how it is you're going to get into those places. Every once in a while you find matatus. You do find matatus, but every once in a while. Now, Karen is worse. You will not see matatus on some of those roads. And I'm thinking...
Now, let's put it in context.
Yes.
Okay? Let's take an elderly person who wants to go to hospital.
Yes.
And they'd like to use public transport.
Yes.
So they're coming from... what's that road that has St. George's? What's it called?
It's called Dennis Pritt.
Dennis Pritt. Okay. So they're coming from Dennis Pritt Road and they need to access a matatu. What's the nearest place that they need to go to?
Hurlingham.
Walk all the way to Hurlingham. Right? Along that road, Agnes Kothek Road.
Yes.
There's about 2 kilometers. Are there pedestrian walkways that this elderly person can actually walk on?
Of sorts.
Is it properly made? And this is what I think we're talking about when we talk about a socially just public transport system. Is it taking care of this person who is an elderly person who is unwell, who is going to hospital?
The walk,
They are going for a bi-weekly or whatever dialysis session at KNH.
I'm happy you mentioned Dennis Pritt Road, because today that person will have to walk all the way to Hurlingham. 30 years ago, that person would have got a bus at what used to be Caledonia Supermarket Shopping Center,
which is the
now-
Kenya National
Yeah,
Examination Council
Council.
headquarters. Yes.
Because, and maybe historically, the bus and let's talk of the bus routing in Nairobi was done in a way that it covered the entire city, and routes were cross city
Yes.
routes basically. Route number 46 would start in Kawangware, goes through Hurlingham, goes through CBD, goes to Huruma. Then there was also, for instance, 47.
Yes.
That would now come through what is now Jakaya Kikwete, then go through that Caledonia, turn in at Chaka Road. And so the initial routing was done intentionally such that the entire city is covered. Route 20, I think it's 22 that used to do Raptor Road and turn in at Church Road, whereas 23 goes straight along Wayaki.
Wayaki Way.
Yeah. So, but now with the emergence of, with a reduction in regulation and the emergence of what we have now, in fact, when you ask me what is a public transport, now what we have is a paratransit, because it's purely based on demand and supply, not based on equitable access. Okay. And once you shift from that regulated system, now some people end up losing out. Okay, and we end up now with that situation now where we even lock out this paratransit from certain areas. You even hear residents saying, we hear it in residents groups, we don't want matatus here.
Yeah.
Because they're seen as
Loud and
loud
obnoxious and
and annoying. And
Constant is even
everything.
worse. You will find that somebody erects a gate.
Yes.
It's
On
a
a
public
road.
road.
Yeah.
Public
Put a gate
road.
open only on one side and
Yes,
there's a watchman
public road. It's not, and somehow it's like you can't access it to go through now. Surely it's.
I mean, I know that is done at times for security, and I've seen many places where at night they close the roads, then during the day. But there are places, like you mentioned, where now it's purely discriminatory. In fact, it's interesting you
And
mentioned
public
Western.
transport, what we call public, then you cannot.
They don't allow them to
Never.
access.
How?
And they
Who
don't
gives
care.
them the authority not to allow public transport through a public road?
That is just lack of appreciation of social justice.
That's it.
Because I've had it from people saying, and I had it from someone once saying, there are too many people who walk outside our place. Because these people were walking from Westlands to Kawangware.
Yes.
So they used to pass through these people's road. No, there are people walking. We
Too
don't
many
want people.
walking.
We don't want people.
Yeah, and it's actually just a discriminatory mindset towards looking down at certain people. We could even call now the urban invisibles, because they don't have the power.
Those are the invisibles.
Yeah, they don't have the power within the society to have a voice. So they're even told, you can't walk here, you can't walk there, you can't.
Someone
go
plants
certain
trees
places.
and flower beds all the way to the road, from the fence of their home to the road, so
Exactly.
that they block this place.
Yeah.
You don't walk around here. I mean, what? 27 minutes to 9. Let's take this quick break. We're talking about a socially just public transport system. What is it, and why is it important, and why should we all think about it?
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.
Conversation continues about a socially just public transport system, one that takes care of everybody, including those who've been described by urban planners such as Constant Cup, our guest, urban invisibles, children, the elderly, persons living with disability, the marginalized people in the society, like we said as we were just going into the break, people who are coming from work and walking home, pregnant women, and such others. If you just think about those people and think about the need to walk, for example, the MP for Westlands constituency actually was raising a question. So they've put up a footbridge at Westlands, expressway or footbridge, okay? This footbridge does not have a ramp for persons with disability. This footbridge, is it conducive for children who be wanting to cross from one side to the other to go to school? This footbridge, is it conducive for, pregnant pregnant women, expectant women who maybe wanted to cross from one side, the elderly, people who are walking with walking aids. If it doesn't have all those things, is that a socially just system? If you think about then the matatus that we have, all right, so matatu, you have to board by using steps. Are those steps low enough for a child to climb? Are those steps low enough for an elderly person, a person with disability? Is there a ramp? Once you get into the matatu, where does this person, is there space for a person with disability to actually use the matatu? So those are the issues in a socially just public transport system. What should we do then?
First of all, let me comment. I know when we talk about public transport, we focus a lot on road transport.
Yeah.
But we also have a small percentage who use the train. And there's been an effort by Kenya Railways to try to achieve some of these objectives. More recently, raising their platforms to enable people on wheelchairs and walking aids to be able to easily access the trains, as well as constructing more stations within the neighborhoods. I used the train once to Embakasi, and I was quite impressed. Now you have a station at Donholm, Pipeline, etc., Makadara, etc. It's still a far cry from what we would really like, which is proper last mile service. However, it's also important that we who are professionals are able to sit down with the people in the matatu sector, okay, with the owners themselves, and tell them, and the policymakers on the same table, and tell them that, look, these are some of the qualities that need to be. Last year we had a roundtable, not a roundtable, more of an urban dialogue with the Nairobi Metropolitan Transport Authority, who are very quite supportive. And Namata's main mandate is around the upcoming BRT, which unfortunately, they have a lot of work to do because of miscommunication earlier on when somebody went and painted a road and people now switched their minds off against BRT. But we discussed the different expectations that people should have as Namata are developing this BRT. And we saw His Excellency the President last week signing a deal with the European Union to work on line 3, which is a very critical line. It covers Dandora, Juja Road, Pangani, all the way to Kenyatta National Hospital. That's a very highly populous area, and I've actually been involved in research with persons with disability in Mathare, and we did a bit of journey mapping on how they do their journeys, and it's very sad when people tell you that I can only go to work past 9 o'clock because the matatus will not allow us to board because they don't want us to go there during rush hour, or someone telling you I'm forced to walk a long distance because the fare is taken up. So for instance, some of the discussions we had with Namata during that urban dialogue included things like universal access, which is supposed to be part of the system. To board the buses are expected to be flat, and people and are supposed to have raised platforms such that people are able, someone who has trouble taking the stairs or is on a wheelchair just goes straight into the bus. I've seen another system where buses in a different country, where buses go below grade level, so they're still at the same level with the platform where people are boarding. And then also things like fares, fixed fares. Reduced fares for children, which is something that used to be there, and this, we did discuss these issues with Namata. Another thing that came up was critical was also labor rights, just as I've talked, workers' rights, plus also having inclusivity in employment, taking care that there's good representation across genders in employment. So through that, that is one avenue that can be taken towards ensuring that public transport is socially just. However, let's not look at it purely from an infrastructure perspective. let's also sit down and agree that we as professionals, and this is one of the things we have in mind, is to actually sit down with the players in the industry, and sit down and look at it even from a business perspective. And one of my colleagues recently had an article in the newspapers on how a socially just public transport system can still be profitable. It doesn't mean that because now you have a flat, low chassis, flat bus, now you're going to go at losses. It can actually be profitable. There are other people who are experimenting with electric buses and in the city. And so far, the feedback we're getting, we'll probably get much more after a couple of months, is that it's very positive. But there is a lot that needs to be done. One of the companies told me that they've had to retrain drivers. Because the drivers are just used to start, stop, which, accelerate and then put emergency brakes to get somebody along the way. Now that also
Simamisha kwa mataa.
Simamisha kwa mataa. Hapa hakuna stage. And they've been able to study the impact of that on the vehicle, which is very negative. And they've looked into retraining of drivers in order to have vehicles lasting much longer. So there's a whole holistic aspect that needs to be looked into it, both from the professional's perspective to the investor to the city itself. And
of those who practice, I mean, the stakeholders here that we're talking about, do you find that there's an appetite to actually make this system in the manner in which it would then be acceptable across board? Because I think that's where most of this starts. If there's an understanding across board that this is beneficial, it really is beneficial across board. If there's a desire to make it so, I think half the work is done.
Yes and no. From some circles, there is willingness to listen. And there's a discussion we had recently over a certain, maybe I don't know if I can name it or not, but over a certain circle that has been taking more and more roots, and existing players are fighting them. So the other day, in fact, I was going for a rugby game at Juja. And then I get to the stage and I notice this circle are charging more than the others.
The new circle.
Yeah. So I spent some time just watching, and more people were boarding them. Then I talked to some friends and they tell me that in Ngong, even when the vehicles are not there, people will queue waiting, but not board these other vehicles. Why? Because 1, the conductors always have change. 2, the vehicle is neat. 3, the driving is sober, for lack of a better word. 4, there is no rudeness. So there is that appreciation. There just has to be more advocacy done towards it, and more recognition of some of these things. I mean, we're coming from a country where 20 years ago, even buildings didn't have ramps. Even just buildings, if someone was on a wheelchair, even to access a shopping mall 25 years ago, it was almost impossible. Now it's part of day-to-day life. So as I always say, it's not something we should look at from a perspective of let's start a blame game and go to the streets. No, let us educate people. Let us appreciate that we are looking at the city from a different perspective, and emerging issues are coming. And even post the 2010 Constitution, there are many more things that now we can appreciate and include in our city planning and our urban development.
Is this as a result of an engagement and a constant engagement by professionals like yourself with the government?
There are many things that have positive things that have come out through such engagements. I always use the NMT policy of Nairobi, non-motorized transit policy of Nairobi, as one example where professional bodies, civil society, NGOs, and government came together to develop that policy. But through further advocacy, now we've begun to see, and we have seen a lot more development of walking facilities within the city. And through also even someone like me just coming here to speak, that is some element of advocacy, and people listen. So there's been a lot of that has helped towards that, and demystifying the old school of thought of prioritizing individual transport over active mobility and public transport.
You know what is actually interesting for somebody who is antiquated like myself? Yes, it's like we have gone back, or we've receded on the gains we had at an earlier time. Because when you talk about public transport, my knowledge of public transport was reliable. You knew where to wait for a bus. You even knew the time that bus would come. So you could actually time it. And you even knew where it would I mean, there were certainties, and you could understand it. Now, somehow...
And the routes were clear.
They were very clear. You knew, and even if you didn't know it, there was always some...
board on the bus.
To tell you exactly what goes where and how it goes where, and at what time it goes where it's supposed to go.
There are many things that we've gone backwards with. We all know that 30, 40 years ago, people used to attend the neighborhood primary school.
Yes.
And that has evaporated.
And the neighborhood dispensary.
Neighborhood dispensary.
You know, we're discussing this in the hour before, and saying that even as we know clearly the yearly increase of our population, and which must be planned for, it's like the population overtook the planning, or if the planning was there, the implementation was overtaken, because the government doesn't build new schools that you can speak of. It's like that has been left to the private sector. Now, people like saying it's a partner. It's not a partnership. A business person sets up a business to make money. Sees a gap. It's not a partnership. Exactly. If it was a partnership, we would be hearing of the government's contribution to that private enterprise. Okay? We'd be hearing how the government, in an effort to increase this...
Facilitated.
Exactly. But we don't hear of it. It's business, pure and simple. Yes.
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean... that foresight is important in order to facilitate planning. Very few, when I ask people, what's the fourth largest urban area in Kenya? Very few people know that it's Ruiru, population-wise.
Even I didn't know.
According to the last census, if you Google
Ruiru town,
Nairobi, Mombasa, Kisumu, Ruiru, then Nakuru. But it's a dormitory town because a lot of them work in Nairobi, and it's continuing to expand. Now, we all know the capital of Kiambu County to be Kiambu Town. But Kiambu County has Ruiru Town, Thika Town, Juja, Kikuyu, which all feed into Nairobi. Now, without that county taking into consideration planning and sitting with Nairobi because of that close influence in planning even this public transport and other facilities, we'll just end up with the chaos that we are seeing in many of these places.
You know what I'm thinking, Constance? Government participation is absolutely crucial to all this. And government understanding we understand understanding exists. But is this one of these things where the public, not the public sector, the public ought to play a bigger role in determining their future rather than allowing it for the government to sort of like lead? Because even when the government has clear directions as to what to do, the uptake is a little slow.
Yes, it tends to be.
Case in point being the JSS.
It tends to be, but there are also good examples. And I'll point out Nakuru City. Nakuru was named a city 2 years ago, or slightly over 2 years ago. And since then, they've been developing what they call the Nakuru City Vision 2050. And they have been consulting professionals, likewise professionals, over how to ensure that this city of theirs is actually socially just. Actually, they've been using those terminologies.
Those words, socially just.
Yeah, that the Nakuru city is able to recognize the dignity of the people. It's able to take into consideration equity and diversity, human rights, and democratic ideals. And they're having engagements with various professionals. Even some of us have been consulted, and we've had discussions with them towards coming up with this vision, from housing perspective to urban mobility to service provision, and through that, they'll be able to now move their city forward and foresee where it wants to be in 2050, because it's a fast growing town. I think about 5-10 years ago, it was the fastest growing urban area in Kenya, especially after 2007, 2008, when many people moved
Migrated
there. So there has been that uptick by some, I would say, city governments or some counties. I've mentioned what Mombasa have done. We've seen a few positive things from Nairobi, although Nairobi they call it this giant
Yes.
that has to do a lot more. And I think if the smaller towns in Kenya create their own niche and create their own face along these lines or pillars of social justice, it will also serve as an example to some of the bigger cities. Because many times, we talk of cities, we first start talking about Nairobi.
Yep.
And we forget that there are many other growing towns. Even Naivasha is a town, it's an urban center. Kakamega is an urban center. These other towns can also, just the way we see European cities, each of them has their own face
And identity.
That's the word I was looking for. Each has its own identity. That's something they pride themselves with. So we also have to look at urbanization from that perspective, and how these principles of social justice, these pillars of socially just public transport, can be inculcated by some of those these other towns. In Nakuru, we've had from engagements with them, there's been a very positive response, right from the very top of the county to the city government, to members of the cabinet, etc.
Some of these things would take either an addition to infrastructure or complete overhaul of infrastructure, right? Some of these things that we're talking about today. If we think about ramps for people living with disability, at public transport entry or exit points, some of those require infrastructure. It requires funding, and we all know the kind of pickle that we get into when we start to hear things like that. Do you think that these things then need to transcend governments? Meaning that most times somebody is going to start on something, even with an idea. I'm sure there are conversations that have been had easily over the last 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years about how these things can improve. Does it need to be given to a special group, a special coming together of folks? Because we also find that projects will start with one administration, and by the time that administration comes to an end after 5 or 10 years, it's nothing, and it has to start again in conversations with somebody else. How would something like this be given the sustainability and longevity that it needs to actually actualize these conversations that are being had?
That's a good question. And a few months ago, Governor Sakaja launched what is called the County Transport Committee, which is supposed to be, actually every county is supposed to have a county transport committee. And the county transport committee is supposed to bring together all players within the transport sector. From NTSA, Kenya Police, Kura, Kenha, County Transport Department, even some of the private players. Now through that you'll have, and that creates now that body that you're talking about, where even including the people from the planning department, where now people are able to streamline and work together towards achieving whatever goals they want, so as to avoid the situation we've seen many times in this country, where we have silos. And today this body does this, tomorrow this other body does this, which is another positive thing, I think, to mention from the governor of Nairobi. Now, I think the onus is on us now to sit down with them and make them understand.
And engage them.
Make them understand these aspects of socially just public transport, make them appreciate the pyramid of mobility as it should be. Otherwise, we may end up forming a committee to avoid to reduce jam. Forming a committee that's aimed at just reducing jam.
Remove matatus from the CBD.
To remove matatus from the CBD. But just to mention also on your first statement, which was some of these things do require infrastructure change and such, but there are also very innovative ways that can be adapted. And I'll point out what we call tactical urbanism. And tactical urbanism is where we do small changes with the expectation of large-scale impact. where you use the city as a lab. Okay. For instance, you can do a temporary road closure so as to experiment how it is when that road is pedestrianized. Or you can put, even let's use drums, because we are familiar with drums.
Kidero drum.
Yeah,
And a roundabout.
drums to test whether something works or not. And it's not something we should look down upon, because it's better we do that testing and see that it works or not, because in some places, like Western's roundabout,
It worked.
At a fire station, one side worked. In fact, I was wishing they did the other side. The other side. Yeah. So that those such tactical urbanism can also help with that, and help in something called incremental planning, where you do things one step at a time, one street at a time, and you're able to transform the city, other than expecting you'll wake up one day
And have
just
that
overhaul
formula that
everything,
works.
which is not possible. You're dealing with millions of people with different thinking, different journey patterns, different ways of doing things.
Constant, always a pleasure having you here. And thank you very much for joining us today. Constant
Asante
Cup
sana.
is an urban planner. He's a member of the International Society of Urban and Regional Planners. We've been talking about a socially just public transport system, a conversation that must continue.